I will not sit next to that woman, and if you don't remove her immediately, I will have this entire airline shut down by morning." Victoria Pemberton's voice cut through the first-class cabin like a blade, her manicured finger pointing with venomous precision at the quiet, elderly black woman reading peacefully in Seat 1A. The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of JFK International Airport's Terminal 4, with the fury of nature unleashed, each droplet exploding against the glass like tiny grenades in a war between earth and sky. Inside the bustling departure lounge, the storm had found a human counterpart in Victoria Pemberton, who stood at the priority boarding gate for Flight 847 to San Francisco, her cream-colored Armani suit impeccable. Despite the chaos swirling around her, her platinum frequent flyer card clutched in her hand like a weapon she was prepared to use against anyone who dared question her authority. At 52, Victoria carried herself with the rigid posture of someone who had never been told no, her late husband's pharmaceutical empire having left her with more money than sense and a complete inability to comprehend that the world didn't revolve around her comfort and convenience. The massive diamond on her ring finger caught the terminal's harsh fluorescent lights, throwing rainbows across her face that somehow made her expression look even colder than it already was. Her lips pursed in perpetual disapproval, as if the very air she breathed wasn't quite up to her standards. "This is absolutely unacceptable," she muttered to herself, loud enough for the young mother with twin toddlers standing nearby to hear and instinctively step away, her voice carrying the particular brand of entitlement that comes from never having to wait for anything in your entire life. "Priority boarding was supposed to begin 4 minutes ago, and I have a medical charity gala to attend in San Francisco tomorrow evening that simply cannot be missed because of airline incompetence." The irony of her attending a medical charity gala while treating the very people around her like they were beneath her consideration was lost on Victoria completely, her world having been so carefully curated by wealth and privilege that she genuinely believed her time was more valuable than anyone else's, her schedule more important, her comfort more deserving of protection than the basic human dignity of those around her. David Chen. The gate agent appeared harried as he juggled passenger manifests, weather delays, and the growing crowd of irritated travelers who were all dealing with the same storm-related disruptions that Victoria seemed to think were specifically designed to inconvenience her personally. His uniform was slightly wrinkled from the long shift, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke to the exhaustion that comes from dealing with entitled passengers who think their platinum status gives them the right to treat airline employees like personal servants. "Ladies and gentlemen," David's voice crackled over the intercom system, competing with the thunder that rolled across the airport like a warning from the gods themselves due to weather-related air traffic control delays. "We will be beginning priority boarding for Flight 847 to San Francisco momentarily, and we appreciate your patience during these challenging conditions that are unfortunately beyond our control." Victoria didn't wait for him to finish the announcement before surging forward like a shark that had caught the scent of blood in the water, her designer heels clicking against the polished terminal floor with a staccato rhythm that announced her approach to everyone within a 50-foot radius. She pushed past a businessman in a gray suit who had been waiting patiently in the priority line, her shoulder bag swinging dangerously close to an elderly man's face as she claimed her position at the front of the queue as if it were her birthright. Finally, she snapped, slapping her boarding pass down on the scanner with enough force to make David flinch, her voice carrying the particular kind of acid that comes from someone who has never learned that basic politeness costs nothing and pays dividends in human connection. "I hope you understand that I am Victoria Pemberton, and my late husband's pharmaceutical companies have partnerships with this airline that generate millions in revenue annually, so perhaps next time you could show a little more consideration for passengers who actually matter." David's smile was practiced and professional, the kind that service workers perfect when they need to maintain their composure while being systematically dehumanized by people who mistake wealth for worth his hands, steady as he processed her documents despite the verbal assault he had just endured. "Of course, Mrs. Pemberton and I do apologize for the weather-related delays that are completely outside our operational control, but we'll have you on your way to San Francisco as quickly and comfortably as possible." As Victoria marched down the jet bridge toward the aircraft, her heels echoing like gunshots in the enclosed space, she passed by the gate area where passengers were still waiting to board, and her gaze fell upon a sight that immediately triggered her well-developed sense of indignation and superiority. Sitting quietly in one of the uncomfortable plastic chairs was an elderly black woman, probably in her late 60s, wearing a simple navy cardigan and gray slacks that looked like they had come from a department store rather than a designer boutique. Her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun that spoke to decades of dignity, maintained despite whatever challenges life had thrown her way. Next to the woman sat a young black boy, maybe 8 years old, his legs swinging slightly as he colored in a book with intense concentration, his tongue poking out slightly the way children do when they're completely absorbed in their creative work. The woman was reading a worn paperback novel, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose, and there was something about her stillness and peace that seemed to radiate outward despite the chaos and noise surrounding them in the busy terminal. Victoria's lip curled in distaste as she observed the pair, her mind immediately jumping to conclusions about how they could possibly afford first-class seats on a cross-country flight, her worldview so narrow and prejudiced that she couldn't imagine any scenario where a black woman and child might legitimately belong in the premium cabin. "Probably using frequent flyer miles or some sort of charity upgrade," she muttered under her breath, her voice carrying just enough venom to reveal the ugly thoughts churning in her mind like toxic sludge. The Boeing 787 Dreamliner was a marvel of modern aviation technology, its first-class cabin designed with spacious pod seating that provided privacy and comfort for passengers willing to pay premium prices for premium service. The ambient lighting carefully calibrated to create a sense of calm and luxury that was supposed to make the flying experience feel more like floating through clouds than being trapped in a metal tube hurtling through space at 600 miles per hour. Elena Washington settled into seat 1A with the quiet grace of someone who had learned to find peace wherever she was, her worn novel open in her lap as she adjusted her reading glasses and tried to ignore the growing commotion around her. At 68, she had survived enough storms in her life to recognize when another one was brewing, and the angry woman who had just entered the first-class cabin was radiating the kind of negative energy that Elena had learned to handle with patience and dignity, rather than confrontation and anger. Her grandson Micah bounced slightly in seat 1C, his coloring book spread across the tray table as he worked on a picture of an airplane that looked remarkably similar to the one they were currently sitting in his 8-year-old imagination, already transforming their journey into an adventure story where he was the pilot, and his grandmother was his trusted co-pilot, navigating them safely through whatever challenges lay ahead. Grandma Micah whispered, his voice carrying the curiosity that only children possess, their minds still open to wonder and possibility, rather than closed by years of disappointment and cynicism. "Why does that lady look so angry? Did someone hurt her feelings before we got here?" Elena glanced up from her book to see Victoria Pemberton standing frozen in the aisle, staring at them with an expression that mixed shock, outrage, and something that looked suspiciously like the kind of panic that comes from having your worldview challenged by reality. "Some people carry pain inside them, sweetheart," Elena replied softly, her voice carrying the wisdom that comes from decades of dealing with people who mistake cruelty for strength. "And sometimes that pain makes them say and do things they might not do if they were feeling better about themselves." Victoria's mouth opened and closed several times like a fish gasping for air, her perfectly applied makeup unable to hide the ugly emotions playing across her features as she processed the sight of Elena and Micah sitting comfortably in first-class seats that Victoria clearly believed they had no right to occupy. "Excuse me," she finally managed to say, her voice rising in pitch and volume as her indignation found its voice, "but I believe there has been some sort of mistake here, because these seats are reserved for first-class passengers who have paid full fare, not for people who are obviously flying on some sort of charity arrangement." Lisa Chen, the head flight attendant, approached with the kind of professional smile that airline employees perfect through years of dealing with difficult passengers. her uniform crisp and her manner friendly despite the tension that was already building in the cabin, like pressure in a volcano before an eruption. "Good evening, Mrs. Pemberton," she said, consulting her passenger manifest on her electronic tablet. "I see you're in seat 1B right here next to the window, and I hope you'll be comfortable during our flight to San Francisco this evening." "Comfortable?" Victoria's voice cracked like a whip, her sense of outrage expanding to fill the available space like gas in a vacuum, her finger pointing at Elena with all the subtlety of a lightning rod in a thunderstorm. "How exactly am I supposed to be comfortable when these people are obviously in the wrong seats, probably using fraudulent tickets or some sort of employee pass arrangement that allows staff family members to fly for free in premium cabins?" Elena closed her book, slowly marking her place with a simple bookmark that looked like it had been handmade by a child. Her movements deliberate and calm, despite the verbal assault being launched in her direction by someone who had clearly never learned that money couldn't buy class or decency. "Young man," she said to Micah, her voice steady and reassuring, "why don't you show me that beautiful airplane you're coloring while the flight attendant helps this lady find her seat?" But Victoria wasn't about to be ignored or dismissed, her entire identity built around being the most important person in any room. She entered her late husband's pharmaceutical fortune, having insulated her from consequences for so long that she genuinely believed she could say anything she wanted without facing any sort of pushback or accountability. "Don't you dare speak to me about finding my seat," she snarled, her voice rising to a volume that made other passengers look up from their phones and magazines, some already reaching for their cameras because they sensed that something significant was about to happen. "I know exactly where my seat is, and it's next to that window, but I absolutely refuse to sit next to people who clearly don't belong in first class, probably using stolen credit cards or fake identification to gain access to services they could never legitimately afford." Ma'am Lisa Chen interjected, her professional composure beginning to crack under the pressure of Victoria's escalating verbal assault, her training telling her to de-escalate, while her human decency recoiled from the blatant discrimination being displayed in front of witnesses. "I can assure you that all passengers in first class have valid tickets and proper identification, and I'm going to need you to take your seat so we can complete the boarding process and depart on schedule." Victoria's laugh was harsh and bitter, the sound of someone who had never been told that her behavior was unacceptable and who genuinely believed that her wealth gave her the right to treat other human beings like obstacles to her comfort. "Valid tickets," she scoffed, her voice dripping with the kind of contempt that comes from a lifetime of looking down on people she considered beneath her notice. "Look at them for crying out loud. Look at how they're dressed. Look at where they obviously come from and tell me with a straight face that they belong in seats that cost $12,000 each." Micah looked up from his coloring book with the kind of innocent confusion that only children can manage, his young mind struggling to understand why the angry lady was saying such mean things about him and his grandmother, his eyes wide with the hurt that comes from being judged for something as meaningless as the color of your skin or the price of your clothes. "Grandma," he whispered, his voice small and uncertain. "Why is she being mean to us? Did we do something wrong?" The confrontation was beginning to draw attention from throughout the first-class cabin, other passengers lowering their newspapers and pausing their conversations to witness the ugly scene unfolding in the front row. Several people discreetly pulling out their phones to record what was quickly escalating from a simple seating dispute into something much more significant and disturbing. The tech executive in seat 2A had his camera app open, while the business consultant in seat 3C was already composing what looked like a social media post about the discrimination she was witnessing in real time. Victoria seemed to feed off the attention rather than being embarrassed by it, her voice growing louder and more aggressive as she realized she had an audience for her performance, her sense of righteousness expanding to match the space available for her indignation. "I demand to speak with the captain immediately," she declared, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had never been refused anything in her entire life, her hands gesturing wildly as she built momentum for what was clearly going to be an epic tantrum. This is a security issue, a safety concern, and possibly even fraud, because there is absolutely no way these people could legitimately afford to be sitting in first class without some sort of criminal activity being involved. Elena reached over and gently took Micah's hand, her touch calm and reassuring despite the storm of hatred being directed at them by someone who had clearly never learned that every human being deserved to be treated with basic dignity and respect, her voice soft and steady as she tried to shield her grandson from the ugliness of adult prejudice and fear. "Don't worry, sweetheart," she murmured, her words carrying the strength that comes from decades of facing down people like Victoria with grace and composure. Some people were never taught how to be kind, but that doesn't mean we have to respond with unkindness ourselves. Lisa Chen was reaching for her radio to call for backup when the heavy cockpit door opened with a soft hydraulic hiss, and Captain James Rivera stepped into the cabin with the measured confidence of someone who had been flying commercial aircraft for more than 20 years. His uniform pressed and professional, his expression already showing the weariness that comes from dealing with passenger disputes that should never have escalated beyond a simple conversation between reasonable adults. At 45, Captain Rivera carried himself with the bearing of someone who had served in the military before transitioning to commercial aviation, his salt and pepper hair perfectly groomed beneath his captain's hat, his eyes already scanning the cabin to assess the situation and determine the best course of action for resolving whatever crisis had prompted his flight attendant to request his intervention. He had seen it all during his career, from drunk passengers to medical emergencies to full-blown mental breakdowns, but something about the tension in the air told him this was going to be different, more complicated, potentially more significant than the usual first-class drama. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the calm authority that comes from years of being responsible for hundreds of lives at a time, his presence immediately commanding respect and attention from everyone in the cabin. "I understand there's some sort of seating concern that needs to be addressed before we can complete our departure preparations, and I'm here to help resolve whatever misunderstanding might have occurred during the boarding process." Victoria practically lunged at him with her complaints, her voice reaching a pitch that made several passengers wince as she launched into a tirade about security risks and fraudulent passengers and the absolute necessity of removing Elena and Micah from first class before the plane could safely depart. "Captain Rivera." She read his name tag while speaking. "I am Victoria Pemberton, and my late husband's pharmaceutical companies have extensive partnerships with this airline worth millions of dollars annually. So I think you can understand why I'm concerned about the safety and security implications of allowing questionable passengers to remain in premium seating areas where they clearly don't belong." Captain Rivera's expression remained professionally neutral as he listened to Victoria's complaints, his years of training and experience, allowing him to maintain his composure even while being subjected to the kind of discriminatory rhetoric that would have made most people extremely uncomfortable. His eyes occasionally glancing toward Elena and Micah to assess their emotional state and determine whether they needed any sort of immediate intervention or protection. "Ma'am," he said, when Victoria finally paused for breath, "I appreciate your concerns about safety and security, which are always our top priority, but I'm going to need to see some evidence of the irregularities you're alleging before I can take any action regarding other passengers who appear to be seated appropriately according to their boarding passes and documentation." Victoria's face turned red with indignation as she realized the captain wasn't immediately bending to her will, her sense of entitlement so deeply ingrained that she genuinely couldn't comprehend why her word alone wasn't sufficient to remove people she considered undesirable from her presence. Evidence, she shrieked, her voice cracking with the strain of her emotional escalation. "Look at them. Look at how they're dressed. Look at their obvious economic situation. Do they look like they belong in $12,000 seats? Or do they look like they're using employee passes or charity vouchers or possibly even stolen credit cards?" Captain Rivera's jaw tightened slightly as he processed the discriminatory nature of Victoria's complaints. his military background and professional ethics making it impossible for him to ignore the fact that he was witnessing a textbook case of racial profiling, disguised as legitimate security concerns, his responsibility as captain extending beyond just flying the plane to protecting all passengers from harassment and discrimination. "Mrs. Pemberton," he said, his voice taking on a slightly sharper edge that suggested his patience was beginning to wear thin. "I cannot and will not remove passengers from their assigned seats based solely on their appearance or your personal assumptions about their financial situation. And I need you to return to your seat so we can complete our departure procedures and get everyone to San Francisco safely and on schedule." But Victoria was too far gone in her righteous indignation to back down, now her entire worldview being challenged by the captain's refusal to validate her prejudices, her voice rising to a volume that could probably be heard throughout the entire aircraft, as she made one final demand that would change everything. "Then I demand that you personally verify their tickets and identification right now in front of everyone, because I absolutely refuse to sit next to people who are obviously flying under false pretenses, and if you won't protect paying customers from potential security threats, then I'll be forced to contact the authorities myself." Elena Washington had remained silent throughout Victoria's increasingly hysterical demands, her book closed in her lap, her hand still gently holding Micah's as she waited for the storm to pass. With the patience of someone who had weathered many such storms before, but now she quietly reached into her simple black purse and withdrew something that made Captain Rivera's expression change completely. It was a small black card mat finish with a gold chip embedded in the center, completely unremarkable, except for the simple embossed airline logo and the words "Executive Authorization" printed in small silver letters that seemed to glow under the cabin lights. Captain Rivera's eyes locked onto the card, and his face went through a series of expressions that started with confusion, moved through recognition, and ended with something that looked very much like military-grade respect, mixed with a healthy dose of shock, his entire demeanor shifting from professional customer service to the kind of deference usually reserved for high-ranking officials and heads of state. The black card in Elena Washington's hand seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, its simple design carrying more authority than all of Victoria Pemberton's screaming and threats combined. And Captain Rivera's reaction to seeing it was immediate and unmistakable, his military posture becoming even more rigid as he processed the full implications of what he was looking at and who he was talking to. "Mrs. Washington," he said, his voice dropping to a tone of profound respect that made everyone in the first-class cabin suddenly understand that something significant had just happened, something that changed the entire dynamic of the situation in ways they couldn't yet comprehend. "I apologize for any inconvenience you've experienced during boarding, and I want you to know that this situation will be resolved immediately and appropriately." Victoria's mouth fell open as she watched the captain's demeanor transform completely. His attention suddenly focused entirely on Elena rather than on her complaints, and demands her brain struggling to process the fact that the quiet woman in the simple cardigan had somehow managed to command more respect from the airline captain with a simple black card than she had achieved with all her threats about pharmaceutical partnerships and million-dollar contracts. "What is that?" Victoria demanded, her voice rising to a pitch that made several passengers wince as she pointed at the card in Elena's hand, her sense of reality beginning to crack around the edges as she realized that her carefully constructed worldview might not be as solid as she had always believed. "What kind of frequent flyer card commands that level of respect, and why are you treating her like she's someone important, when she's obviously just another passenger who doesn't belong in first class?" Elena looked at Captain Rivera with eyes that held decades of wisdom and experience, her expression calm and composed despite having been subjected to 20 minutes of verbal abuse and discrimination from someone who clearly had never learned that human worth couldn't be measured by the price of your clothing or the size of your bank account. "James," she said quietly, using his first name with the familiarity of someone who had every right to do so. Perhaps you could explain to Mrs. Pemberton exactly what this card represents and why you're showing me the respect that every passenger deserves regardless of their appearance or economic background." Captain Rivera straightened his shoulders and turned to address Victoria directly, his voice carrying the weight of official authority as he explained something that would fundamentally alter her understanding of everything that had just transpired. "Mrs. Pemberton," he said, his words measured and precise, "the card you're looking at is an executive authorization issued by Pacific Aviation Holdings, the parent company that owns this airline and approximately 73% of the commercial aviation market on the West Coast." Victoria's face began to lose color as the implications of his words started to sink in, her brain struggling to process the idea that the woman she had been attacking might actually be someone with real power and authority, rather than just another passenger she could bully into submission through sheer force of entitlement and aggression. More specifically, Captain Rivera continued, his voice gaining strength as he realized he was finally able to set the record straight about something that should have been obvious to anyone with basic human decency. "Mrs. Elena Washington is the chairman emeritus and majority shareholder of Pacific Aviation Holdings, which means she doesn't just own a seat on this aircraft. She owns the aircraft itself along with every other plane in our fleet, and every employee who works for this company, including myself." The silence that followed this revelation was so complete that you could hear the aircraft's environmental systems cycling through their automated routines, the gentle hum of air circulation and climate control suddenly seeming loud in the absence of human voices as every passenger in first class tried to process what they had just learned about the quiet woman in seat 1A. Elena Washington had built one of the largest aviation empires in the world, from nothing, starting as an aircraft mechanic in an industry that barely tolerated women, much less black women, and working her way up through sheer determination, brilliant strategic thinking, and an absolute refusal to accept the limitations that others tried to place on her ambitions and dreams. After her husband's death in a small plane crash 35 years earlier, she had channeled her grief into building a company focused on safety, dignity, and respect for every person who worked for her or flew on her aircraft. "I began working for Mrs. Washington 12 years ago." Captain Rivera continued, his voice carrying the gratitude of someone whose career had been saved by Elena's intervention after I was blacklisted by every other major airline for refusing to fly an aircraft that I knew had safety issues, and she personally hired me when no one else would even return my phone calls, giving me a second chance that allowed me to continue doing the job I love while maintaining my commitment to passenger safety above all else. Victoria's legs seemed to give out slightly as she absorbed this information, her hand reaching for the nearest seat back to steady herself, as her brain tried to reconcile the image of the quiet woman in the cardigan with the reality of someone who controlled billions of dollars in aviation assets and employed thousands of people across multiple continents. "But she looks like," Victoria started to say, then stopped as she realized that finishing that sentence would only make her appear more foolish and prejudiced than she already had. "She looks like a grandmother traveling with her grandson." Captain Rivera finished for her, his voice carrying a note of disapproval that suggested he was struggling to maintain his professional composure in the face of such blatant discrimination. "Which is exactly what she is, in addition to being one of the most respected business leaders in the aviation industry, and someone who has probably forgotten more about running an airline than most people will ever know." Micah looked up from his coloring book with wide eyes, his 8-year-old mind trying to understand why everyone was suddenly talking about his grandmother like she was famous or important, when to him she was just Grandma Elena, who made the best chocolate chip cookies in the world and always had time to help him with his homework, no matter how busy she was with her work. "Grandma," he whispered, tugging gently on her sleeve, "are you really the boss of all the airplanes? Does that mean you could let me meet the pilot sometime?" His innocent question brought a small smile to Elena's face, the first moment of genuine warmth in what had been a very ugly and unnecessary confrontation. Micah Washington possessed the kind of pure curiosity that only exists in children who haven't yet learned to be afraid of asking difficult questions or approaching strangers with genuine interest in their thoughts and feelings. And as he looked at Victoria Pemberton's shocked and confused expression, he felt the same concern he would have felt for any adult who seemed upset or troubled, his young mind naturally gravitating toward kindness rather than judgment. Unbuckling his seatbelt, Micah slipped out of his seat and approached Victoria with the fearless compassion that children display before the world teaches them to be suspicious of others, his small hand reaching into his backpack to pull out a brand-new box of crayons that he had been saving for the flight. "Excuse me, lady," he said, his voice soft and respectful in the way his grandmother had taught him to speak to adults. "You seem really sad and angry, and sometimes when I'm feeling bad, drawing pictures makes me feel better. So, would you like to use some of my crayons to color something pretty?" Victoria stared down at the child, offering her his art supplies with such genuine concern for her emotional well-being, her brain struggling to process the kindness being offered by someone she had just spent 20 minutes trying to have removed from the aircraft based solely on the color of his skin. Her worldview cracking further as she realized that this 8-year-old boy was showing her more grace and compassion than she had shown anyone in years. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly as the full weight of her behavior began to settle on her shoulders like a heavy blanket of shame and regret. "Why would you want to help me after the terrible things I said about you and your grandmother?" Micah tilted his head to one side with the thoughtful expression that children get when they're considering something important. His young face serious as he formulated his response with the careful consideration that Elena had taught him to give to questions about human behavior and emotions. "Well," he said, settling cross-legged on the floor beside Victoria's seat, with the casual comfort of a child who felt safe everywhere he went. "My grandma always tells me that when people are mean, it's usually because they're hurting inside about something else, and she says the best way to help someone stop hurting is to be extra nice to them until they remember how to be nice back." Elena watched her grandson's natural empathy in action with a mixture of pride and heartbreak, knowing that he was displaying the kind of emotional intelligence that took most adults decades to develop if they ever developed it at all. His ability to see past Victoria's cruelty to the pain underneath, representing everything she had tried to teach him about responding to hatred with love and understanding with compassion. "Are you hurting about something?" Micah asked Victoria directly, his 8-year-old directness cutting through all the adult complications and getting straight to the heart of the matter with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "Because you seem really, really sad under all that anger. And my mom always says that anger is just sad, wearing a scary mask to protect itself from getting hurt even more." Victoria's carefully constructed facade began to crumble as she looked into the innocent eyes of a child who was offering her friendship despite having every reason to be afraid of her. Her throat tightening with unshed tears as she realized that Micah was right, that beneath all her rage and entitlement and demands for respect was a deep well of grief and loneliness that she had been trying to fill with money and status and the illusion of control over other people's lives. "I lost my husband 6 months ago." She admitted the words coming out in a broken whisper that seemed to surprise her as much as anyone else, her hand instinctively moving to the wedding ring she still wore, despite the fact that the man who had given it to her was never coming back. "He had cancer, and I watched him get smaller and weaker every day, and I couldn't do anything to save him no matter how much money I spent on treatments or specialists or experimental therapies that promised miracles but delivered only false hope." Micah nodded with the solemn understanding that children sometimes display when confronted with the reality of adult pain, his young mind processing the information with remarkable maturity as he began to understand why Victoria had been so determined to control everything around her. "That must have been really scary," he said softly, his voice carrying genuine sympathy for her loss. "Watching someone you love get sick and not being able to fix it, because grown-ups are supposed to be able to fix things, right?" Elena felt her own eyes filling with tears as she watched her grandson demonstrate the kind of emotional wisdom that she had spent a lifetime trying to cultivate his natural ability to find the humanity in someone who had shown him nothing but cruelty, representing the best of what people could be if they chose compassion over judgment and understanding over condemnation. After he died, Victoria continued, her voice growing stronger as she found herself talking to someone who was listening without trying to fix her or judge her or offer empty platitudes about how everything happens for a reason. I felt like I was disappearing too, like maybe I had only existed in relation to him. And without him there to need me and depend on me, I wasn't anybody at all. Micah reached out and gently patted Victoria's hand with the unconscious comfort that children offer when they see someone in pain, his touch carrying more healing power than any therapy session or grief counselor could have provided. "But you're not disappearing," he said with absolute certainty, his 8-year-old logic cutting through her existential crisis with startling clarity. "You're right here, and you're talking to me, and you're sad about your husband because you loved him, which means you're definitely somebody because only somebody can love someone that much." The other passengers in first class were watching this exchange with expressions ranging from amazement to shame, several people reaching for tissues as they witnessed a child teaching an adult about the fundamental truths of human connection and the healing power of genuine empathy offered without conditions or expectations of reciprocation. As Micah's words settled into the space around them like seeds finding fertile ground, Victoria began to see Elena Washington not as a threat to her comfort or a target for her displaced anger, but as another human being who had survived loss and built something meaningful from the wreckage of her grief. Someone who might actually understand the terrifying emptiness that comes with losing your anchor to the world and having to figure out how to exist without the person who made you feel like you mattered. "Mrs. Washington." Victoria said, her voice barely above a whisper as she struggled to find words adequate to address someone she had spent 20 minutes trying to dehumanize and remove from her presence. "I owe you an apology that goes so far beyond anything I could possibly say that I don't even know where to begin, because what I did to you and your grandson was inexcusable regardless of whatever pain I might be carrying around inside my heart." Elena closed her book completely and turned in her seat to face Victoria directly, her expression showing neither judgment nor anger, but rather the kind of patient understanding that comes from having lived through enough storms to recognize when someone else is drowning in their own turbulent emotions. "Victoria," she said, using the woman's first name with deliberate gentleness. "Grief makes us do things we never thought we were capable of, and loneliness can turn us into people we don't recognize when we look in the mirror. But that doesn't mean those actions don't have consequences, or that they don't reveal truths about ourselves that we might prefer not to acknowledge." Victoria nodded, accepting Elena's words with the humility of someone who was finally beginning to understand the magnitude of what she had done, and why it mattered beyond just the immediate discomfort she had caused to two innocent people who had done nothing wrong except exist in a space she had decided they didn't belong in, based solely on their appearance. "I grew up poor." Victoria admitted the words coming out like a confession that she had been holding inside for decades, her voice growing stronger as she found the courage to tell the truth about herself for the first time in years. "My father was a janitor, and my mother cleaned houses for wealthy families, and I spent my entire childhood being told that I wasn't good enough, smart enough, or worthy enough to dream of anything better than scrubbing floors and emptying trash cans for people who looked right through me like I was invisible." Elena listened without interrupting her expression, showing no surprise at Victoria's revelations, because she had suspected that someone who worked so hard to maintain their superiority over others was probably compensating for deep-seated feelings of inadequacy and unworthiness that traced back to childhood experiences of being treated as less than human. "When I married Richard," Victoria continued, her voice gaining momentum as she allowed herself to remember the person she had been before wealth and status had hardened her heart against anyone she perceived as a threat to her carefully constructed identity. "I thought I had finally escaped all of that, finally proven that I was worthy of respect and consideration. But now I realize that I just became the kind of person who had hurt me when I was young and vulnerable and desperate to belong somewhere. Micah was listening to Victoria's story with the intense focus that children bring to narratives that help them understand the complex world of adult emotions and motivations, his young mind working to process how someone could transform from a victim of cruelty into a perpetrator of the same kind of harm they had once experienced themselves. "My grandmother started with nothing too," Micah offered quietly, his voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone that children use when stating what they consider to be obvious truths. "She told me that her daddy worked on airplanes but wasn't allowed to fly them because of his skin color, and she said that made her want to own all the airplanes someday, so she could make sure everyone got to fly no matter what they looked like or where they came from." Elena smiled at her grandson's simplified but essentially accurate summary of her life story. His ability to distill complex historical and personal information into concepts he could understand and share, representing exactly the kind of wisdom she hoped to pass on to him before he encountered the world's attempts to teach him that some people were more valuable than others based on arbitrary characteristics they couldn't control. "Building this company," Elena said, her voice carrying the weight of decades of struggle and triumph, "wasn't just about creating a successful business or accumulating wealth for its own sake, but about proving that excellence and integrity and respect for human dignity could be profitable, that you didn't have to choose between being successful and being decent, and that everyone deserved to be treated with kindness regardless of their background or circumstances." Victoria felt something inside her chest begin to crack open as she realized that Elena had taken the same pain and discrimination that Victoria had experienced and transformed it into something that helped other people, rather than using it as justification for causing more pain that she had chosen to break the cycle of cruelty, rather than perpetuating it in the name of protecting herself from further harm. "I became everything I once hated." Victoria whispered the words carrying the full weight of her recognition that she had spent decades turning herself into the kind of person who would have looked down on her younger self with contempt and dismissal. "I turned my pain into a weapon that I used against people who reminded me of who I used to be, as if hurting them could somehow erase my own memories of being hurt." Captain Rivera had been watching this exchange with growing understanding of the human dynamics at play, his respect for Elena Washington deepening as he witnessed her ability to find compassion for someone who had attacked her and her grandson with such vicious prejudice. Her demonstration of grace under pressure, representing exactly the kind of leadership that had made her company a model for the entire aviation industry. Captain Rivera found himself in the unprecedented situation of witnessing a real-time transformation taking place in his first-class cabin. Watching as a woman who had spent 20 minutes demanding the removal of passengers based on racial prejudice began to understand the fundamental humanity of the people she had been attacking. But his responsibilities as captain required him to consider not just the emotional dynamics at play, but also the safety and comfort of all passengers aboard his aircraft. "Mrs. Pemberton," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had ultimate responsibility for the well-being of everyone on the flight, "while I appreciate that you're beginning to understand the inappropriateness of your earlier behavior, I have to consider whether you can remain on this aircraft, given the level of disruption you've caused and the distress you've inflicted on other passengers who paid for a peaceful and comfortable travel experience." Victoria felt her stomach drop as she realized that her moment of recognition and attempted redemption might not be enough to undo the consequences of her actions, that there might be a price to pay for the pain she had caused that went beyond simply acknowledging her mistakes and expressing regret for the harm she had inflicted on innocent people. "Please," she said, her voice breaking as she looked between Captain Rivera and Elena, understanding that her fate was now in the hands of the very people she had tried to have removed from the aircraft. "I know I don't deserve any consideration after what I've done, but I was flying to San Francisco to attend a medical charity gala in my late husband's memory, and if I miss that event, I'll be letting down all the cancer researchers who are depending on the fundraising to continue their work." Elena and Micah exchanged a meaningful glance, one of those wordless communications that pass between family members who know each other well enough to understand entire conversations through simple expressions, and Elena's slight nod indicated that she was thinking along the same lines as her wise young grandson. "Captain Rivera," Elena said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who owned the aircraft and employed every person on it, but chose to exercise her power through suggestion rather than command. "I believe Mrs. Pemberton has had a genuine moment of recognition about the harm her behavior has caused, and while that doesn't excuse what happened, it does suggest that she might be capable of growth and change if given the opportunity to demonstrate her commitment to doing better." Micah climbed down from his seat and approached Captain Rivera with the fearless confidence of a child who had never been taught to be intimidated by authority figures, his small hand tugging gently on the captain's uniform sleeve to get his attention. "Captain Rivera," he said, his voice carrying the earnest sincerity that only children can manage. "My teacher at school says that when someone makes a mistake, the best thing to do is help them learn how to do better next time, instead of just punishing them for being wrong, because punishment doesn't teach anybody anything except how to be scared." Victoria watched this 8-year-old boy advocating for her well-being with tears streaming down her face, her heart breaking as she realized that the child she had tried to have removed from the aircraft was now using his influence with the adults around him to protect her from the consequences of her own cruelty, demonstrating the kind of grace and forgiveness that she had never learned to offer to others or herself. Elena was observing Victoria's emotional response with the keen eye of someone who had spent decades evaluating people's character and potential for growth. And what she saw was not the entitled narcissist who had boarded the aircraft, but a broken human being who was finally allowing herself to feel the full weight of her actions and their impact on others. "I have a proposal," Elena said, her voice carrying the tone of someone who was accustomed to solving complex problems through creative thinking and collaborative effort. "Mrs. Pemberton mentioned that she's attending a medical charity gala in San Francisco, and as it happens, my foundation is one of the primary sponsors of that same event, which means we'll be seeing each other again tomorrow evening, regardless of what happens here today." Captain Rivera raised an eyebrow at this unexpected connection, understanding that Elena was about to suggest something that would transform this situation from a simple passenger discipline issue into something much more complex and potentially transformative for everyone involved. What if Elena continued her eyes moving between Victoria and Micah as she formulated her idea instead of removing Mrs. Pemberton? "From the flight, we allow her to continue to San Francisco with the understanding that she will attend the charity gala, not as a pharmaceutical heiress making a grand appearance, but as someone who is genuinely committed to learning about the work being done to help cancer patients and their families, particularly those who don't have the financial resources to access the best treatments." Victoria's breath caught in her throat as she realized that Elena was offering her not just forgiveness, but an opportunity to channel her grief and anger into something constructive, a chance to honor her husband's memory through service to others, rather than through the empty gestures of writing checks and attending galas for the social recognition, rather than the charitable impact. "My foundation," Elena explained, focuses specifically on ensuring that advanced cancer treatments are available to patients, regardless of their economic circumstances, because I believe that survival shouldn't depend on your ability to pay for the medications and procedures that could save your life. The irony was not lost on Victoria that the woman she had attacked based on assumptions about her economic status was offering her a chance to work with an organization dedicated to helping people who faced the same kind of discrimination in healthcare that she had just displayed in her treatment of Elena and Micah. "There would be conditions." Elena continued, her voice taking on the firmness of someone who was offering genuine opportunity but expected genuine commitment in return. including a public acknowledgement of what happened here today and a commitment to spending time with cancer patients who are struggling financially, not just writing checks, but actually listening to their stories and understanding how privilege and prejudice affect access to life-saving treatments. The flight to San Francisco passed in a strange bubble of quiet reflection and tentative conversation with Victoria seated across the aisle from Elena and Micah, close enough to continue their dialogue but far enough away to give everyone space to process the emotional upheaval of the past hour and consider what it might mean for all of their futures. Elena had returned to her book, but Victoria noticed that she frequently looked up to check on Micah or to offer small gestures of kindness to other passengers and crew members, her behavior providing a master class in how to wield power and influence with grace and consideration for others, rather than using it as a weapon to intimidate and control. Micah had shared his coloring book with Victoria, and she found herself working on a picture of an airplane with surprising concentration, her hands moving automatically while her mind struggled to process the fundamental shift in her understanding of herself and her place in the world that had occurred in the space of a single conversation with an 8-year-old boy and his grandmother, Mrs. Washington, Victoria said during a quiet moment when the flight attendants were preparing the meal. "Service, can I ask you something that might sound strange coming from someone who treated you so terribly just a few hours ago?" Elena looked up from her book with the patient attention she gave to anyone who approached her with genuine curiosity or a sincere desire to understand something important, her expression encouraging Victoria to continue with whatever question was weighing on her mind. "How do you do it?" Victoria asked, her voice barely above a whisper as she struggled to articulate something she had never thought to ask anyone before. "How do you remain kind and generous when people have hurt you, when they've tried to diminish you or dismiss you or treat you like you're less than human because of things about yourself that you can't change and shouldn't have to change?" Elena considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, understanding that Victoria was asking not just about forgiveness, but about the fundamental choice between allowing pain to make you bitter or using it as motivation to create a world where fewer people have to experience that same kind of harm. "I think about Micah," Elena said, simply glancing at her grandson, who was absorbed in drawing what appeared to be a very detailed airport terminal, complete with tiny passengers walking through the corridors. "I think about the world I want him to grow up in, and I realize that the only way to create that world is to be the kind of person I want him to encounter when he's out in the world without me to protect him." Victoria felt tears welling up in her eyes as she understood the profound responsibility that Elena felt not just to her own family, but to every child who would have to navigate a world full of people who might judge them based on their appearance or background rather than their character and potential. "Every time someone treats me with disrespect or tries to make me feel small," Elena continued, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had survived decades of discrimination and transformed it into a source of strength rather than a reason for revenge. "I have a choice to make about whether I'm going to respond with the same energy they're giving me, or whether I'm going to respond with the energy I want to see more of in the world." Micah looked up from his drawing with the bright smile that seemed to be his default expression, his young face radiating the kind of joy that comes from feeling completely safe and loved in the presence of adults who have committed themselves to protecting his innocence while preparing him for the realities of life. "Grandma says that meanness is like a cold," he explained to Victoria with the matter-of-fact tone he used for sharing important information. "If you catch it from someone else and then give it to someone else, pretty soon everybody has it. But if you don't catch it in the first place, then it can't spread." Victoria marveled at the simplicity and accuracy of this metaphor, understanding that Micah had managed to explain in one sentence what theologians and philosophers had been trying to articulate for centuries about the nature of good and evil and the individual responsibility each person has for either perpetuating or interrupting cycles of harm. "I want to be different," Victoria said, the words coming out with the force of a commitment being made not just to Elena and Micah, but to herself and to the memory of her late husband who had dedicated his life to healing rather than harming. I want to figure out how to use my grief as fuel for helping other people, instead of as justification for hurting them. But I honestly don't know where to start, or how to begin undoing decades of selfishness and entitlement. Elena reached across the aisle and gently touched Victoria's hand, her gesture carrying more healing power than any therapy session or self-help book could have provided, her touch conveying acceptance and encouragement, without minimizing the work that lay ahead or pretending that good intentions alone would be sufficient to create real change. "The beginning," Elena said softly, "is exactly where you are right now, recognizing that change is necessary and being willing to do the hard work of examining your own behavior and its impact on others, even when that examination reveals things about yourself that are difficult to accept." As the aircraft began its descent into San Francisco, Victoria felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the tight knot of anger and fear that she had been carrying around for months since Richard's death. And for the first time since the funeral, she felt like she might be able to breathe freely again. The charity gala at the St. Francis Hotel was everything Victoria had expected in terms of opulence and social prominence, with pharmaceutical executives and medical researchers mingling under crystal chandeliers, while a string quartet played classical music that provided elegant background for conversations about breakthrough treatments and funding priorities. But everything felt different to her now as she moved through the crowd. Not as a pharmaceutical heiress demanding recognition, but as someone genuinely interested in learning about the work being done to help people she had never bothered to think about before. Elena had introduced her not as Victoria Pemberton, widow of pharmaceutical magnate Richard Pemberton, but simply as someone who was interested in learning about cancer treatment accessibility, and the difference in how people responded to her was immediately apparent when they weren't trying to impress her or extract donations from her, but were instead focused on sharing their passion for the work they were doing. Dr. Maria Santos, a researcher from UCSF who was working on developing affordable alternatives to expensive cancer treatments, spent 20 minutes explaining her work to Victoria without ever asking about her background or her potential for financial support. Her enthusiasm for her research infectious as she described the challenges facing patients who couldn't afford the medications that could save their lives. "The science exists to help these people, Doctor," Santos said, her voice carrying the frustration of someone who understood that knowledge without accessibility was useless to the people who needed it most. "But the economic barriers are so significant that we might as well be talking about treatments that exist on another planet, for all the good they do for families who are watching their loved ones die because they can't afford a drug that costs more than they make in a year." Victoria found herself thinking about her own experience with Richard's illness, remembering how she had never had to worry about whether they could afford his treatments or whether their insurance would cover experimental therapies, how money had removed every barrier except the ultimate one of mortality itself. And she began to understand for the first time how privilege had shielded her from realities that millions of other families faced every day. Elena appeared at her elbow with Micah in tow, the 8-year-old looking slightly overwhelmed by the formal atmosphere of the gala, but maintaining his characteristic curiosity about everything around him, his eyes wide as he took in the elegant decorations and the serious conversations happening around him. "How are you doing?" Elena asked Victoria, her voice carrying genuine concern for someone who was being challenged to see the world through completely different eyes. For the first time in decades, her question acknowledging that growth and change were uncomfortable processes, even when they led to positive outcomes. "I'm learning," Victoria replied, her voice carrying a note of wonder at how much she was discovering about herself and the world around her in the space of a single evening. "And I'm beginning to understand that I've been living in a very small world despite having access to resources that could have made it much larger and more meaningful." Micah tugged on Victoria's dress to get her attention, his small face serious as he prepared to share something important that he had been thinking about during their conversations on the plane and throughout the evening. "Mrs. Victoria," he said, using the formal address his grandmother had taught him for speaking to adults. My grandma says that when people have a lot of something like money or toys or cookies, they get to choose whether they keep it all for themselves or share it with people who don't have enough, and the choice they make shows what kind of person they are inside their heart. Victoria knelt down to Micah's eye level, understanding that this child was offering her wisdom that would guide the rest of her life if she was wise enough to accept it. His innocent insight cutting through all the complex philosophical and ethical questions about wealth and responsibility to arrive at a simple truth about human decency and compassion. "You're absolutely right," she said, her voice breaking slightly as she realized that an 8-year-old boy had just offered her a roadmap for how to honor her husband's memory in a way that would create meaning rather than just maintain status. "And I think your grandma and you have helped me figure out what kind of person I want to be for the rest of my life." Elena watched this interaction with the satisfaction of someone who had witnessed genuine transformation taking place, understanding that Victoria's recognition of her own capacity for change was just the beginning of what could become a lifetime of service and growth, if she remained committed to the difficult work of examining her own behavior and its impact on others. 6 months later, Victoria Pemberton could be found every Tuesday evening at the St. Mary's Cancer Support Center, not writing checks from a comfortable distance, but sitting in folding chairs in a circle with patients and families who were navigating the complex world of cancer treatment, without the financial resources that had made her own experience with Richard's illness traumatic, but not impossible. She had learned to listen rather than talk, to ask questions, rather than offer solutions, to provide comfort, rather than advice. And most importantly, she had discovered that her greatest contribution was not her money, but her presence, her willingness to sit with people in their pain, without trying to fix it or escape from it, or minimize it with empty platitudes about everything happening for a reason. The Pemberton Washington Foundation had been established with Elena's guidance and Victoria's pharmaceutical connections, focusing specifically on making advanced cancer treatments accessible to patients, regardless of their economic circumstances. But more importantly, it had become a model for how wealth could be used to create bridges between communities rather than walls, how privilege could be transformed from a source of separation into a tool for connection and understanding. Elena continued to fly commercially on the anniversary of her husband's death, usually in economy class, where she could observe how her airline treated passengers who didn't have black cards or special status. Her commitment to maintaining dignity as the baseline standard for all passengers, rather than a luxury reserved for those who could afford premium services, never wavering despite the growth of her company and her personal wealth. Captain Rivera had been promoted to chief pilot and director of training, his experience with the Victoria Pemberton incident having convinced Elena that he had the wisdom and character necessary to help other airline employees understand that their job was not just to transport passengers safely from one place to another, but to treat every human being with respect and consideration regardless of their appearance or economic circumstances. Micah Washington, now 11 years old, continued to accompany his grandmother on business trips whenever his school schedule allowed his presence, serving as a constant reminder to everyone they met that kindness and wisdom were not dependent on age or experience, but were available to anyone who chose to approach the world with curiosity and compassion rather than fear and judgment. The ripple effects of that single flight continued to expand far beyond the aviation industry, creating waves of change that touched lives in ways that none of the original participants could have anticipated when they first encountered each other in the first-class cabin of Flight 847. Elena's dignity protocol had been adopted by service industries across the country, from hotels to restaurants to retail establishments, all recognizing that treating customers with respect, regardless of their appearance or perceived economic status, was not just morally right, but also good business practice that created loyalty and positive word-of-mouth advertising that money couldn't buy. Victoria's transformation from entitled pharmaceutical heiress to devoted patient advocate had inspired other wealthy individuals to examine their own relationship with their resources and privileges, leading to the establishment of similar foundations that focused not just on writing checks to worthy causes, but on creating genuine connections between people from different economic backgrounds who could learn from each other's experiences and perspectives. The Pemberton Washington Foundation had become a model for collaborative philanthropy that emphasized relationship building and mutual understanding, rather than the traditional donor-recipient dynamic that maintained separation between those who gave and those who received. Most importantly, the story of how an 8-year-old boy's innocent questions had prevented a corporate crisis and transformed a moment of ugly discrimination into an opportunity for growth and healing had become required viewing in schools across the country, with educators using Micah's example to teach children about the power of approaching conflict with curiosity and compassion, rather than fear and anger, demonstrating that even the youngest voices could contribute to creating a more just and understanding world if they were brave enough to speak up when they witnessed unfairness or cruelty. That flight changed everything, proving that transformation is possible even in the most unlikely circumstances, and that sometimes the most powerful force for change is a child's simple question about why people choose cruelty over kindness. If this story moved you, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more stories about justice, redemption, and the power of human connection to overcome even the deepest prejudices. What would you have done in Captain Rivera's position? Share your thoughts.